Thank you everyone so much for joining the National Civic League's May webinar, Improving Equity and Resilience by Reducing Social Isolation. My name is Rebecca Trout, and I am the Program Director of the All-America City Award here at the National Civic League. The League is a 125-year-old nonprofit, and we aim to advance civic engagement to create more equitable and thriving communities. One of our flagship programs is our All-America City Awards, and this program began in 1949 to recognize outstanding civic engagement achievements in local communities. While we use our awards program to celebrate these communities, we really use these webinars to lift up projects by past All-America City Award winners and to share tools and programs and ideas that we think will help with communities' engagement efforts. Before we begin, I just wanted to give a quick plug for this year's All-America City Award. We are focused on building equitable and resilient communities. It's in a little less than 2 weeks. We have 20 excellent finalists this year. They come from 15 different states, and they range in population size from 9,000 to over 1 million, so all are welcome. We hope that you'll join us for the award event. Registration is now open. It will include finalist presentations, keynote speeches, roundtable discussions on issues of race and equity, resilience and sustainability, as well as cultural entertainment showcases. So definitely encourage you to join us for that. But today we are focusing on and featuring Healthy Places by Design's suggestions and solutions for curbing social isolation. I'm joined here by 3 wonderful presenters. Joining me, we have Risa Wilkerson. She is the Executive Director of Healthy Places by Design, Dr. Jonathan Garcia, Director of Global Health, Oregon State University, and Ruben Cantu, Program Manager of the Prevention Institute. Before I hand you over to their capable hands, just a few housekeeping rules. You'll notice that everyone is on mute. We ask you to remain that way throughout the presentation. If you have questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat or use the raise hand feature at the end of the webinar when we will moderate any Q&A that you might have. We are also recording today's webinar, and the meeting recording and slides will be sent to you following today's webinar. And with that, I am happy to hand you over to Risa. Risa?
Thank you, Rebecca. I am going to share my slide and make sure that everybody can see them. Can you see them? Yay. Okay, great. Well, again, thank you for inviting us to be here. It is such an honor to be here with Jonathan and Ruben and all of you to talk about such an important issue. Healthy Places by Design partners with health-focused funders to provide technical assistance to community leaders and coalitions. And we coordinate collaborative learning networks of local groups and states that are working to advance equity and health. You can learn more about us at our website, healthyplacesbydesign.org. So why are we here talking with you about socially connected communities? Well, we know that leaders who strive to create equitable and healthy communities often focus on physical and mental well-being, while overlooking social well-being. Addressing conditions that impact health, like housing and healthcare, education, food, recreation, transportation, jobs, clean air, and water are all vitally important. But when we focus solely on physical and mental well-being, we miss the vital contributions of social well-being. What is social well-being? It's the strength of a person's relationships and social networks, and it's strongly linked to social inclusion and a sense of belonging. People living in socially connected communities are more likely to thrive because they feel safe and welcome and trust each other and their government. Trusting, meaningful relationships enhance our mental, physical, and emotional health and well-being. In fact, as you see on the slide, strong social connections and networks can boost a person's lifespan by 50%. Therefore, solutions to social isolation are urgently needed for the deep impact we're all striving to achieve. Most people talk about social isolation and loneliness as one and the same. It's important to note that they are different. You can feel lonely and still have a lot of connections. On the flip side, you can be socially connected and still feel lonely. I guess I said that, just said that. Social isolation is a state in which people are not engaging with others or have minimal number of social contacts and quality relationships. So they are connected in that sometimes loneliness is a symptom of social isolation, but again, they're not the same. In recent decades, people in the United States and around the world have experienced social isolation, soaring rates of social isolation with profound impacts on health and well-being. And this was well before the pandemic shuttered our gathering places that served as antidotes to social isolation. In fact, social isolation is linked to increased risk of death from all causes and is as bad for your health as smoking, obesity, elevated blood pressure, and high cholesterol. Who is socially isolated? We need better data for sure, but current metrics indicate that people of all ages and demographics, identities experience isolation. It's exacerbated by experiences like long-term illness and disability, domestic violence, loss of a loved one, becoming a caregiver or having a baby, moving to a new place, migration, being rejected by family members and peers for your identity, incarceration, and homelessness. In fact, in other words, it's widespread. People who are most susceptible to social isolation are those who feel they do not belong to majority social groups because of their gender identity, race, ethnicity, or sexual orientation, among other factors. So consider the impact then on those experiencing intersectional marginalized identities. For example, being Black and trans and poor and rural. Social isolation is not a personal choice or individual problem. It's one that is rooted in community design and system injustices, as well as social norms. Consider, for example, terms that label socially isolated people as hermits or loners, which frames isolation as a consequence of choice or failures or traits. Systems are designed in a way that lead to isolation and oppression. These are just a few of the examples of the systems that are designed in that way. Let's take a closer look at a few. Public buildings and public spaces are often inaccessible for people with disabilities, making their participation in public life difficult or impossible. Some public spaces display historic symbols or artwork which favors certain races and worldviews while omitting and offending others. Systemic racism and oppression can make it unsafe for people of color, LGBTQ, immigrants, and others to safely gather. If we look at the housing system, we see that public policies such as redlining have created racially segregated neighborhoods where discriminatory lending and other practices have stymied home values. This isolates certain students in poverty-concentrated schools and produces extreme wealth disparities. And we know poverty further exacerbates isolation. Disinvestments in racially segregated neighborhoods also lead to crime by design and cause people to isolate so as to protect themselves from violence in their neighborhoods. We have laws in the US that essentially make homelessness and poverty a crime, resulting in the forced removal of people from public spaces. And if we look at our transportation system, we know that we have a history of highway development that intentionally has split communities of color, resulting in a legacy of severed social networks and polluted neighborhoods. Travel by anything other than automobile is often stigmatized, and related investments often bypass low-income areas which would benefit the most. Pedestrian rates are also disproportionately racialized. I'd like to pause there and bring in Jonathan and Ruben to share with us their thoughts about what you have learned from the communities you serve about the structural drivers of social isolation. Jonathan, would you like to go first?
Absolutely. And thank you so much, Risa. And thank you, Rebecca, for inviting us. It's a real pleasure to be here with the National Civic League. It's a very important organization. And so it's a pleasure to share our work As a director of Enlace, or the Engaging the Next Allies for Change and Equity program, I have the pleasure of having a team of wonderful people, including Neely Yosha at Outside the Frame, an organization that amplifies the voices of marginalized youth, as well as Mario Magaña and Nancy Vargas for their leadership in Enlace, the Oregon State Extension and 4-H program. And I also want to thank Robert Wood Johnson Foundation for funding the Enlace program. And so to your question about the causes of social isolation, our work really tries to emphasize intersectional social isolation, which you've already started to think about. And in this case, you're thinking about being Latinx and LGBTQ and being a new American and living in rural counties and so forth. And so families and religious organizations, as well as cultural enclaves, are really important sources of social support for Latinx youth, and social support can protect them from the consequences of racism and xenophobia, especially in places where there are predominantly white contexts, such as Oregon. And so, but Latinx youth often fear disclosing their LGBTQ identities to avoid disrespecting the family. The family, therefore, can be a major source of potential conflict for LGBTQ youth, and youth can actually lose access to housing security as a consequence of being rejected by their families and communities during the coming out process. And the main individual level outcomes of social isolation and rejection include depression, suicide attempt, substance use, sexual risk, among others. Some studies have actually indicated that youth who have been rejected by their families are up to 8.4 times more likely to attempt suicide later in life. So this issue of social isolation is a really important one, and it most of the time is a life and death issue. Nodding back to what you said about the fact that it's not about character traits, we did have a lot of participants talk about and blame themselves for their experiences with social isolation. They said things like, it's the reasons they were socially isolated, or being too dark, if you are ugly, not having social class, not knowing English. And so these are things that the youth said. And they wanted to pass as white, they wanted to pass as straight, as cisgender women, because they saw these as having positions of privilege. And so that left them having identity strain, feeling that they didn't have anyone in whom to confide in. This starts to help you understand why social isolation and rejection is so linked up to very severe outcomes like suicide. And so, yes, so those are some of the findings we had in our project.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's quite sobering and important to hear. Thank you. Ruben?
So thanks so much, Risa, for the opportunity, and Rebecca and the National Civic League. And playing off of a couple of the things that Jonathan just mentioned, through my work at Prevention Institute, which is a national nonprofit organization that works to prevent illness and injury before it has a chance to happen. One of the biggest projects that I've worked on, and one of the most rewarding projects, is a project called Making Connections for Mental Health and Well-Being Among Men and Boys, which looked to improve mental health in those populations through changing community conditions and addressing kind of some of those same structural drivers that we're talking about. I'll talk a little bit more about Making Connections in a little bit, but through that work, I got to work with 3 specific populations and learned quite a bit about the things that are driving social isolation for them. For example, in San Diego, I worked with several organizations that were working with the East African refugee population in the city. San Diego's home to the second largest East African refugee population in the US after Minneapolis. And there they felt very acutely the racism and Islamophobia that they were facing really limited their ability to fit in and to find a place where they belonged in the city. And they came up with some great strategies to try to address that. Another group I worked with was a group of student veterans at Kankakee Community College in Kankakee, Illinois, which is kind of an exurb of Chicago, about an hour and a half outside of the city. And there, those students and those that were working with them really felt that it was the school system, the community college system, and the community college itself that didn't really recognize the specific needs that veterans, and particularly those dealing with PTSD, were dealing with, and how that led to spaces, physical spaces at the university, at the community college that didn't really meet their needs, or that were triggering responses from them due to the PTSD. And then finally, another community that I worked with in the Kalihi Valley, which is a low-income community near Honolulu, they found that a lack of job opportunities, a lack of leadership opportunities, and a lack of safe, active transportation options were leading to isolation for that community as well. And so through working with all of these, it really kind of makes clear that social isolation is not a personal choice. It's something that's really driven by systems, policies, practices that are the things we can change, that we should be working on. So I'll go into a little bit more detail about what these folks actually did to address those structural drivers.
Thank you so much, Ruben. I appreciate that. All right, so now that we've kind of made the case that social isolation is really a community level issue, what can we do? Oops. Well, in 2020, we had a social isolation learning network that Jonathan and Ruben both were a part of, along with 60 other practitioners in the field. And we had some robust conversation throughout the year about the drivers of social isolation and, you know, what kind of guiding kind of principles we thought were important when we wanted to see change in the world. And so we worked together with these practitioners who serve diverse populations in equally diverse settings and co-created a set of resources, a report, the cover of which you see on the slide, and 2 action guides to help reframe the national conversation toward one that recognizes the root causes of and systemic solutions to social isolation. I hope that all of you have been able to review the resources or will review them if you haven't done so already. Our hope in co-creating these resources was to inspire and equip all readers, especially grant-making organizations and local government leaders, to intentionally redesign community-level systems in order to support meaningful social connections. Everyone who seeks to create healthy communities, we know and agree, must prioritize social well-being, which includes rebuilding broken trust in government and institutions. Guided by concepts such as asset-based approaches, equity and inclusion, and cultural and historic context, the Learning Network developed these 5 recommendations simply as starting points for addressing social isolation to kick off conversations across the sectors. 3, as you can see, the first 3 are focused on the built environment and 2 on norms and inclusive practices. Each of these have a dedicated chapter with even more specific recommendations. We'll take a quick look, even though we don't have time to go as deeply as would be ideal, so you can see what's inside. The first is about co-creating inclusive, healthy public spaces that encourage social interaction. So, for example, designing spaces for all ages to gather, encouraging intergenerational exchange, developing policies that decriminalize loitering and enable more innovative use of parks and public spaces. For example, winter fire pits in parks. We also talked about housing and the importance of, I think I skipped a slide. Nope, okay. Housing and the importance of affordable, inclusive housing through zoning and other design measures that can help residents gather and make social connections. For example, housing first strategies that include wraparound supports and co-locating parks with affordable housing wherever possible. We urge transportation planners and decision makers to prioritize movability with walking and bicycling networks and other supports, like lowering traffic speeds and working on air quality, and ensuring that these options are well connected to the places that people visit most often. Play streets doubling as summer food service sites, is one example of utilizing transportation facilities as gathering spaces. Invest in inclusive practices and community-led solutions, our fourth recommendation. This includes things like creating universal broadband access, co-creating the first three, public spaces, transportation networks, and neighborhood gathering spaces, with the full diversity of residents in your community. For example, you could try mapping the artistic and cultural assets of cities, towns, states, and tribal communities with a focus on the cultural resources in communities of color and low-income communities. Finally, we urge everyone to make social connection prioritize social connection as a community norm. Every aspect of community life can either enhance or suppress social well-being. All sectors have a role to play. And when community leaders pair a social and all policies framework with approaches that are culturally relevant, gender inclusive, and trauma and resilience informed, they demonstrate what their community values, which is people, all people. Such efforts help improve trust between residents and leaders and open the door for conversations about a future where everyone experiences absolute belonging and social well-being. So now I'd like to turn it over to Jonathan to describe a little bit more about his program in LACE.
Absolutely. Thank you, Risa. And thank you for setting the stage in terms of the solution. Here I will talk a little bit about in LACE in relation to those last two recommendations that you made about social connectivity and spaces that are inclusive. And so within LACE, the Engaging the Next Latinx Allies for Change and Equity program, we're trying to address those root causes of social isolation at the cultural and structural level. And because current models, has already been mentioned, place the responsibility of social isolation on the individual, we want to reframe this as a systems problem. And so this program sought to reframe the meaning of citizenship and civic responsibility within the 4-H environment. Participants in our focus groups highlighted the importance of compassion, allyship, and solidarity in building communities with this key component of citizenship. They wanted to shift the meaning of citizenship away from a word that really was packed with othering experiences related to immigration laws or the experiences of public charge rules that kept them from accessing basic needs, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I'll describe the process through which LGBTQ Latinx youth co-created the intervention to train their peers in 4-H. And in doing this, the project recognizes the need to create and co-create these intersectional safe spaces that celebrate race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and gender identity as integral parts of youth's self-concept. In the next slide, you'll see more about our work in co-creating social connectedness. So we did this by co-creating telenovelas with the youth. And here you see one of the shots from making of the telenovelas in one of the local schools in Portland. And so in this project, we worked with multiple stakeholders and a 45-member community advisory board, which included Latinx, LGBTQ youth, health and social service providers, 4-H youth, 4-H parents. And we engaged this community advisory board with the overall goal of developing a critical consciousness intervention. That means really trying to understand where oppression lies in our daily interactions to change those ways in which we reinforce oppression. And the focus was the 4-H Outreach Leadership Institute, where a lot of Latinx youth and youth of color are trained in college prep, in social skills and leadership, civic engagement and community mobilization and outreach, but really incorporating this intersectional safe space aspect. And so these focus groups, we engaged the youth and the parents and the providers to see what their perceptions of social isolation were and to gauge their ideas for changing, with the ultimate goal of providing themes for the co-creation of a telenovela-inspired intervention, which includes 5 videos that were made with the LGBTQ Latinx youth, as well as a manual and worksheets and a range of activities that form our curriculum. And I'll show you some of those products. We have a couple of posters that we've created as part of the activities. And so the themes that were related to these came out of our focus groups included building solidarity based on mutual identification. And so trying to identify with each other by tapping into our personal experiences with marginalization, social exclusion, and isolation. And the second one is navigating social institution. That includes families, religious institutions, schools, and 4-H. Third, dealing with bullies. And fourth, the meanings of citizenship and community participation. And the last, which really taps into all of these, is accessing health and social services. In order to do this, we engaged 4-H champions as allies and leaders in our communities. So one of the greatest challenges in this project was to bridge understandings and relationships between Latinx communities, which sometimes have traditional religious values that are contrary to LGBTQ inclusivity on one side, and then the other side, LGBTQ Latinx youth who have experienced intersectional social rejection in their lives. So really trying to build solidarities on this basis of mutual identification. And for this reason, we worked with champions as spokespeople to generate community buy-in and recruit parent-child dyads for our workshops. And so here you see a picture of Cynthia and Cecilia, parent and child champions that were 4-H alum and her mother. And Cynthia became a very important member, co-author of papers and really integrated into the analysis of our work, and because our work is really community-led from the beginning to the end. And so in the next slide, you will see a picture of our premiere screening at the Outside the Frame Gala before an audience of 400 people. And that was in November 2019 when 400 people could gather, not 4,000. In the current stages of our work, we're amplifying community voices in film screenings such as this, conferences, podcasts, and 4-H workshops. And the key is our pilot workshops that we're conducting. And we're also interviewing parent and child dyads about their experiences with social isolation during the COVID-19 pandemic and their perspectives on vaccines. We adapted our workshops to an online format as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, which actually might be a silver lining of our experiences with social isolation, because with the online format, we hope to reach those who wouldn't have been reached with the Outreach Leadership Institute, although the free transportation and buses would have brought a large portion of them that still would have missed a portion of those who were out in remote rural areas. And so we're piloting our virtual intervention to examine its feasibility and effects on participants' self-reported social isolation, civic responsibility, and self-efficacy as LGBTQ allies. And a big part of this, of course, is our critical consciousness building workshops. So far, we've interviewed and enrolled 30 parent-child dyads in our online workshops. And in these workshops, the youth, a part of this dyad, are trained as allies using the telenovela videos and our curriculum on empathetic listening and solidarity. So really tapping into their personal experiences and emotions to understand and try to either provide space or identify a story that is reminiscent of the feeling that the other person is expressing. Mental health consequences of discrimination and systems of oppression, addressing bullying, navigating resources, and finally pledging allyship and solidarity. And so the last activity, as I mentioned, involves everyone who decides to make a poster that they would use in a peaceful demonstration. And here are a couple of the posters that I wanted to feature of really important messages: Black trans lives matter and LGBTQ rights are human rights. And so our youth are able to make these posters and send them back to us, of course, because the workshops are conducted online and I mail them the supplies. So it's been really wonderful. Qualitatively, we found that the meanings of allyship have ranged from tolerance to compassion to an allyship that's meaningfully based on solidarity and mutual identification and becoming co-conspirators. One parent shared, as parents, we're the main educators. The main lessons are love and respect. I don't think we need a degree to teach our kids. Compassion is what is really needed in these times. Parents' perspectives of allyship was grounded in core values that resonated with their religious perspectives, including love, respect, and compassion, and the golden rule. And for youth, it was really important then to also push the envelope a little bit and expand the definition of allyship beyond compassion and tolerance. As LGBTQ youth who works as an outreach worker explains, she's looking for co-conspirators who are willing to lose it all to be on my side with me. And so we've had a wonderful time training youth, and we are continuing to do this over the summer and over the course of the fall as well.
Thank you, Jonathan. Ruben?
Thanks, Risa. So I mentioned earlier an initiative that at Prevention Institute we've run since 2015 called Making Connections for Mental Health and Wellbeing Among Men and Boys. This was a national initiative made up of 16 local coalitions across the US that were working to improve conditions for two specific populations of focus. About 2/3 of these coalitions were working on mental health and well-being among men and boys of color, and the other third were working on strategies addressing the needs of veterans and military service members. So two populations in the US that are dealing with high rates of mental health challenges, trauma, and issues related to social isolation as well. The initiative is funded by the Movember Foundation, which is the largest global men's health philanthropy. And the purpose of the initiative, like I mentioned, was really focused on improving the community conditions that drive mental health and trauma, mental health challenges and trauma in those communities. But most importantly, perhaps, was that this initiative over the course of the 5.5, 6 years that it's run was an opportunity to bring residents, to bring community members that were part of those populations of focus together to jointly build coalitions, to identify their community's needs, and to develop strategies together to address the mental health challenges that they were facing, including things like social isolation and the lack of connection, by really looking at the things in the community, those structural drivers that were leading to the challenges that they were facing. So on the next slide, I'll go on the next slide. Thank you. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the work of the group we were working with in San Diego that I mentioned briefly earlier, United Women of East Africa. As I mentioned, the East African refugee community in San Diego was one that, you know, they were facing a great deal of discrimination and racism and Islamophobia, which the community members felt, which made the community members feel like they didn't belong. Some of the young men that were part of the initiative talked about how they had to act one way when they were in school, they had to act another way when they were hanging out with their friends outside of school, they had to act another way when they were at home with their parents, and it felt like they were always trading one mask for another, and they didn't have a place where they could be themselves. And this stress was creating a great deal of challenges for them. Some of them were turning to substances, some of them were turning to gang involvement. There was a string of suicides in the community when they realized we need to do something to make a change. And this initiative gave them the opportunity to bring their community members together and identify, like, what is it that we need? What is it that we want to look at and address so that we can make things better for our brothers? And what they decided that they needed was a culturally and community-based and rooted space, like a physical space where they could come together, gather, connect, and support each other. And through that space and having that space, they could build the connections, strengthen the relationships among the community members, so that then they could go out and start addressing some of the other challenges that they were identifying in their community, like a lack of a living wage, poor public housing, a lack of educational and employment opportunities. These were all other things that they identified in their needs assessment process, but they recognized that they needed to have the space where they could come together and build their connection, build their community, and build their capacity to be stronger advocates. And so they were able to then, build that capacity within each other, within each other and with each other, and they were able to become really strong advocates for broader systems and policy change. And they became very active in the movement for Black Lives over the course of the last year, as many cities across the country were dealing with police shootings. And so they've become a really strong example of the importance of the strength that connection can bring to a community that wants to move toward broader systems and policy change. On the next slide, with the group that I mentioned earlier in Kankakee, Illinois, at Kankakee Community College. The community college has a high number of student veterans enrolled in classes. And they were realizing that they did not have a space where they could connect either. They were a population that was dealing with a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder and trauma from their time in the military, and the spaces on campus that they could use to connect with each other and to gather, they realized were not really built with their needs in mind. For example, they would have a space where they could gather, but all of the seating was oriented so their backs were to the doors or their backs were to the windows. And whenever anybody would come into the space, everybody would stop what they were doing, immediately turn around, and were just prepared for the worst. And it was just that emotional response and that emotional trigger that really didn't give them a space where they could relax with each other, connect with each other, and support each other. And so what the sponsor of the student veteran organization on campus did is they interviewed a number of the students on campus that were veterans. They listened to them. They gathered community and faculty support so that they could then develop a student veteran center on campus that was oriented to meet their specific needs. And now that space is flourishing. It's a place where everybody, like throughout the entire day, whenever I've visited, there's people that come in and out of the space every day. They're able to connect with each other. They're able to feel comfortable, and they're able to also build their capacity to continue to work as a cohort on campus. And the final example I will share on the next slide is going back to the group that I mentioned earlier in the Kalihi Valley near Honolulu. They were a group of Kakua Kalihi Valley is a federally qualified health center in Honolulu in this neighborhood. And it was a mostly low-income community of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander folks. And they recognized that there was a lack of job opportunities, a lack of leadership opportunities, and not really great options for safe, active public transportation in the community, particularly for the young men and boys who live in the community who didn't have a place to gather and come together. And one of the things that they recognized and saw is that these young men were gathering near the health clinic to work on their bicycles together. They all had a passion for their bikes. And so they ended up finding a space within the health clinic that they could build out and turn into a bike shop for the young men to come together. They integrated leadership training as part of the work that they were, as part of the bike shop. And they also integrated talking circles for the young men to connect with each other and share about the challenges that they're facing and their dreams and their aspirations and the things that they wanted to change in their community. And through the combination of their passion for bikes, their increasing leadership capacity, they were able to start identifying community conditions, community factors that they wanted to change in their community. One was the creation of safe bike paths in the community. So they were able to identify what they wanted to have done, partner with some of the public policy advocates that were connected to the clinic, and go to their local city council and advocate for safer bike paths for the community. And they ended up being successful in doing that. So they went from a community that was feeling isolated and that didn't feel like they had the resources or the leadership to get change, to get positive change in their communities, to one that was able to build their capacity and build their leadership so that they could see through that kind of community and environmental change that they needed. I think that's the last of my slides. Yep, thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. I stopped sharing because I'd like to pause now and open it up for questions and conversation. I invite people to go ahead and put your questions into chat, and Rebecca will help us to sort of monitor those. To kick it off, I'd like to start with a question for each of you, which is, how has your work around strengthening social connections advanced civic engagement or civic responsibility and racial justice? Ruben, you're unmuted. Would you like to start first?
Sure. Going back to something that I think all of us have picked up on and mentioned throughout the course of today's session, centering communities and centering the populations that are most impacted and most at need is the way to get us to civic engagement and racial justice. Giving folks the opportunity to build their capacity, identify the challenges, identify and design their own solutions is the way to get to this. Residents and community members know what the challenges are. They know what the solutions are. They know what they want to see happen in their communities. A lot of times they might not have all of the details around, how do I draft legislation? How do I, make sure that I've got an appointment to speak in front of our city council or our county board of supervisors? They might not know how to do all of that, but that's the role that community organizations and community advocates can play. But by partnering together, by centering those community needs and really having the focus be on them, that's the way that you can advance and get civic engagement to the place where it needs to be so you can advance racial justice.
Ruben, Jonathan?
Yeah, and so I thank you for that question. I also wanted to advocate for intersectional safe spaces in response to that as a solution-based approach, especially because a lot of the participants in our work felt isolated in ethnic enclaves or in queer spaces through lateral oppression. And so there were few spaces that provided them acknowledgement and celebrated all of their selves. And so one of the things that can be done at the local government level, for instance, is to support the maintenance of intersectional safe spaces. And Ruben provided several beautiful examples of spaces where people can congregate and feel a part of and feel that they're celebrated for each and every one of their identities. And so maintaining safe spaces that are because one of the challenges for program-based funding is that these spaces are oftentimes seen as, just a part of recruitment or just a part of not letting people go off after follow-up, so loss to follow-up prevention, or getting people to go to community spaces for testing or for screening events. They're seen as secondary to the primary outcomes. And so my argument is that these are not secondary. In fact, they're necessary to implement any health-related or social well-being related intervention because they allow for people, to congregate and to not feel isolated, which is so key for many of these health outcomes.
Thank you. Yeah, so please put your questions into chat or do a raised hand as we continue on. I'll ask one more question here. Both of you were a part of the Social Isolation Learning Network last year, which was a series of conversations with a variety of folks who are working, kind of on the ground to try to reduce social isolation. And we had a conversation about that centered on the idea of absolute belonging as a vision for social well-being. I'm wondering if you would say that that idea resonates with your work and the people that you've been working with and sort of the places and structures. Does that resonate in terms of creating stronger social connections? If it does, how will we know when we're on the right track? John, would you like to start?
Sure. And so my understanding of absolute belonging is really captured by two ideas, right? So it's captured by this idea of having empathy for others based on tapping into our own experiences with marginalization. And so therefore trying to draw on our experience to not only help others, but to feel their pain or to be there and feel their joy and celebrate them. Right. And then the other concept is solidarity, right? So beyond empathy, because I think that empathy really sometimes creates a dynamic of those who are helping and those who are helped. Solidarity brings people together for a common cause to fight systems of oppression. And, that could seem a little bit theoretical. But you can see this all the time in common examples where people are competing for resources because there are limited resources, and so this minoritized group and this minoritized group might feel like they need to advance their causes and their agendas over each other, and that's just a function of the system of oppression, right? And so if there's a solidarity-based approach, that system of oppression that puts us in competition with each other can potentially be overcome. And that's an ideal, right? And so for this idea of absolute belonging, I think both empathy and solidarity would be really key ideas to pursue.
Right. I totally agree with everything that Jonathan just said. I feel like the idea of absolute belonging really resonates with the work that we're trying to do, both through this initiative and other initiatives that we're trying to advance that touch on social connection and social isolation. And I think that, we need to take a look at what we're doing to make sure that, they're equitable, that they're centering the community, and that they are racially just solutions as well. I think there's, arguably nothing as important in our community and kind of our growing understanding over the last year around structural barriers, structural drivers, and structural violence. Like I think one of the positive outcomes of the increased outcry for racial justice in the world over the last year has been a broader recognition of what structural racism is and what structural drivers are. I think there are more people than ever that kind of get that and know that, and people are talking about that, which is great. We need to take that to the next step and actually move from talking about it and thinking about it and knowing what it is to moving toward action and making sure that all the work that we do has that lens to it, and that we're kind of thinking about it and applying that to the work that we're doing, making sure that we're elevating those voices, making sure that we're putting them at the center of planning, making sure that we're lifting up positive narratives of what's going on in our communities. So many times for all of the communities that we're talking about, and all of these, I don't say just marginalized communities, but intentionally marginalized communities, because that's what they are. You know, we need to make sure that instead of the stories that we always hear about communities and low-income communities and communities of color, BIPOC communities, LGBT communities, we need to be lifting up those positive stories and those positive narratives. And that goes a long way to shifting behaviors, shifting norms, shifting beliefs, which is such an important part of actually changing policies and practices and systems.
Yeah, thank you both. I appreciate those answers. We have a question in chat from Carrie. Thank you, Carrie. Carrie says, any thoughts on how best to do this work when funding is not as robust as in these examples? We coordinate a time bank that provides infrastructure for community members to exchange services and build social cohesion in southern New Mexico. Very cool. Ruben or Jonathan, any thoughts about that?
I'll take a crack at it. And so one of the things is that I even in the way that Carrie phrased her question, there are many assets that I see in there, right? So there's already an infrastructure in that community. There's already a setting where people are exchanging ideas. And so starting with the existing assets and with those stories, so maybe capturing stories among those members in that setting, and sharing those stories within and outside of those networks. That can be done with a cell phone, and a pretty low cost way of filming and narrating and just talking about those experiences. The other thing is peer-to-peer and training the trainer have become really shining models of how to build community throughout health interventions and community-based interventions. And so what I see is that you have the building blocks, and with a few low-cost adjustments to really sharing those stories, you could really create a project that resonates with a lot of people.
Right. I think that's exactly right, Jonathan. And my counsel usually around a question like this is that a lot of times when we're talking about some of these big issues that sometimes feel so immovable, just because of the size of them, they become these wicked problems that are really hard to solve. And it feels like it's overwhelming to be able to solve it on your own. That's where partnership comes in. That's where coalition building and collaborative building and networking becomes such an important piece of this. We can achieve more together than we can apart, especially when it comes to a huge issue like social isolation, or when we're thinking of solutions that are about changing what often feel like these intractable systems and policies and practices that have been ingrained in the fabric of the country from the beginning. And so it really does mean having to work together, partner together, bring people together to be able to do that work.
Yeah, thank you both. And thank you for that question, Carrie. We're coming to the last few minutes here. So I would like for everyone to just bear with me and close your eyes for a moment. And let's imagine a socially connected community where people know and trust their neighbors and people from different neighborhoods, where they're motivated and supported through fair processes and practices to be civically engaged, where structures, policies, and relationships connect residents to important services, resources, and inclusive spaces, and where through various signals, people see themselves represented and feel welcomed in their community. During this pivotal moment in history, socially connected communities are more important than ever. Making this a priority can help address past and current traumas due to structural and systemic oppression and build more cohesive, resilient, and equitable communities where everyone is able to thrive. I'm hoping all of you will join us today in creating this vision. You can open your eyes. So just a few first steps, we would hope that you could check out the resources that were shared in the chat box and will be shared afterwards. Take a look at those. There's other references in there for good resources produced by other organizations that you would recognize. We hope that you'll talk with other people about the importance of social well-being and begin to incorporate this in as a priority into your current strategies as a multi-solver. And all of us, Jonathan, Ruben, myself, and others who were part of co-creating those resources want to be of help. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Risa, Jonathan, Ruben. It was very enlightening. I love the end of ending with a call to action. I'm going to steal that. But appreciate your time and taking time away from this important work to share it with us, so that we might all do a little bit of the same in our lives and in our communities. So everyone who joined us today, thank you so much for being with us. As I mentioned at the beginning of the call, we were recording this, and you will receive a follow-up email with this recording and the slides, as well as the resources that were dropped in the chat. My contact information will be on that. Some of the presenters' contact information were in the slides, but please reach out if you have any questions or want to follow up with anyone. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day.